Let's understand foreign keys. First of all, why do we need a foreign key? Imagine you have a users table and every user can write a comment in your app. This would happen in Instagram, for example. So how do we know which user has written which comment? We will know by using a foreign key. And what would be a good reference to uniquely identify a user? Maybe the username, maybe the email. Well, usually you use the ID. Since that one is unique, it should never ever change and is therefore statically assigned to a user forever. So we'll save the user ID as a foreign key in the comments table to uniquely identify the user who has written every single comment. So how can we do that in SQL? First of all, let's create a table, users for example. This users table will have an ID, for example, to uniquely identify every single user. This ID will be unsigned, auto increment, and it will be the primary key of this table. Now let's also say we are having a username, which is a varchar of maybe 255 characters. Let's execute this code and let's now say we want to insert into users. We want to assign our username to every single user. And for the values, we are going to say, first up, we are going to use Jonas, for example. For the second one, we are going to use Winnie. And for the third one, we are going to use Jeremy, for example, like so. Now let's execute the code. Let's select everything from users. And as you can see, now we have those three users. Now let's also create a comments table, for example. So create table comments. We're going to say that every single comment will have an ID. That is an integer, unsigned, auto, increment, and this one is the primary key as well. So this ID will be used to uniquely identify every single comment. So we have one ID for the users table to identify every single user, and we have one ID for the comments table to identify every single comment. Now a comment might also have a message. That can be a varchar. Maybe we have a text of 255 characters. This one can also be a text though, so it doesn't really matter for this example. But now how can we link the user and the comments table? Because obviously our ID is used to uniquely identify every single user and to uniquely identify every single comment, and linking them wouldn't really make too much sense. So this one is pretty easy. We are just going to say we are going to store a user ID instead of our comments table right here. So this user ID is the reference to the user right here. So if the user with an ID of 1, for example, so Jonas is going to write a comment, we will store the user ID 1 inside of this comments table right here. And this user ID needs to be equal to the ID that we have created right here. So this needs to be an integer as well, since our user IDs are integers. It needs to be unsigned as well. And like this, it is kind of alright. But now we've just created this user ID. And in SQL, you also need to define that this user ID is a foreign key. So we say foreign key user ID references. What kind of ID does this one reference? So what kind of ID does this one store? This stores the ID of the user that has commented. So this one references our users table. And inside of this users table, it references the ID. But imagine you have a user, for example, who is on Facebook, Instagram, and now he decides to, for example, delete his profile. What should happen right now? Should the comments stay? Should the comments be deleted? And in most cases, I would say it makes a lot of sense to say that we want to delete all of the comments that reference a user. In order to do so, we can use onDelete, which defines what we want to do on delete. And most of the time you will use cascade right here, which means if the user will be deleted, you will also delete all of the corresponding comments to this user. And the same function also works for onUpdate cascade. So if you would, for example, change the ID of a user, so you update the user, then this will also update the reference right here. But obviously, usually you should not update the user ID. So this is something that doesn't really occur too often. And right here for the user ID, you also need brackets surrounding the user ID. Right here, we need an underline, and now let's execute this code. And as you can see, we have created this table right here. Before going further, let me show you the alternatives to cascade, which essentially means If the user will be deleted, for example, also delete the comments. If the user will be updated, also update the comments. You can also say that you want to set this one null, for example. So the user ID will just be null if the user will be deleted. So that is an option as well. You can also use restrict, for example, which means as long as there exists corresponding data, you should restrict the deletion. So if you have restrict, the user cannot delete his own account as long as there exists corresponding comments to the user that wants to delete his account, for example. So now that we've understood the most important concepts, let's insert a comment, for example, and see how this one looks. So we have the users table that has the columns ID and username, and we have the comments table that has the columns ID, message, and user ID. So to insert into comments, for example, we need to insert a message and a user ID at least. For the values, let's say our user with the ID of 1 writes a message that is delete yourself, for example. So that one has an ID of 1. And now we are just going to copy that one. And let's say our second user says stop the in, for example, and has the ID 2. And now let's say we also have a third user, for example. So this one, for example, says, hey guys. So now we have those comments. We can execute the code. And as you can see, we now have some comments inside of our database. So now let's select everything from users. We're going to execute the code. As you can see, we have those users. And now let's select everything from comments, for example. So we have those IDs. And as you can see, we also have an ID for every comment, and we also have a linked user ID for every comment. So this ID of 1 essentially references, instead of our other table, the user Jonas. The second comment references our user Winnie, and the third comment references our user Jeremy.